The phone began to vibrate on the metal exam table at 9:17 p.m., a harsh mechanical buzz that cut through the antiseptic quiet of the small veterinary clinic. Evan Cross stared at the screen without touching it. Unknown number. Video call. He already knew who it was. Outside, a freight train wailed somewhere along the river, low and mournful, the sound of steel grinding against steel. Ranger lay on the floor a few feet away, the German shepherd's broad chest rising unevenly beneath a blood-stained bandage wrapped around his head. Evan's hands were still wet, smelling faintly of iodine and iron. He swiped to answer. The screen filled with the calm, expensive face of Dominic Marlowe. Perfect lighting, perfect suit. The kind of man who looked like he never raised his voice because he never had to. "Mr. Cross," Dominic said pleasantly, as if greeting a colleague late to a meeting, "I assume you've found the vehicle." The camera tilted. The image shifted. A warehouse floor came into view. Bare concrete, harsh fluorescent light, and a single metal chair in the center. Maya Bennett was tied to it, duct tape across her mouth, her eyes wide but burning with defiance. A bruise was already blooming along her cheekbone. Behind her stood a man holding a pistol, his finger resting casually along the frame. Not shaking, not nervous, professional. Evan felt the familiar surge hit his chest, sharp and electric. The same spike he'd felt years earlier when a radio went dead in a desert that didn't officially exist. His pulse jumped, but his face didn't change. Panic was a luxury he'd buried a long time ago. Dominic's voice returned, smooth as polished marble. "We're going to make a simple exchange. You have something that belongs to me, a small drive. I have something that belongs to you. Bring it to the old Franklin foundry. Come alone, no police, no federal friends. If I see even a hint of interference..." The man behind Maya pressed the barrel lightly against her temple, just enough to make the point. "You have 1 hour." The screen went black. For several seconds, Evan didn't move. The clinic felt too small, the walls closing in, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. Ranger let out a low, pained whine, and the sound cut deeper than the threat ever could. Evan knelt beside the dog, resting a hand on the thick fur at his neck. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor, weak but loyal. That was the thing Dominic Marlowe would never understand. Power wasn't money or men or guns. Power was trust. And trust made people do impossible things. 1 hour, 60 minutes. In that time, a city like Philadelphia could swallow a person whole. In that time, a corrupt system could look the other way, paperwork could vanish, cameras could malfunction. In that time, men like Dominic built their empires quiet deals, clean hands, violence outsourced and invisible. Evan had seen it before, overseas and at home. Different language, same playbook. Criminals loved deadlines because deadlines forced fear, and fear made people sloppy. Evan stood and walked to the sink, scrubbing his hands until the water ran clear. He caught his reflection in the stainless steel unshaven, eyes ringed with exhaustion, shoulders permanently tense like a man bracing for impact that never quite came. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be a ghost drifting between cheap motels and forgettable jobs, counting hours until sleep finally won. But that life ended the moment Maya's face appeared on that screen. There was a lesson Evan had learned the hard way, one that didn't come from any manual or training pipeline. When someone gives you an hour, they think they own the clock. They think you're negotiating. You're not, you're being tested. Tested to see whether you'll break, whether you'll trade one life for another, whether you'll believe that survival requires obedience. Evan knew better. He also knew this wasn't about courage or revenge. It was about choices, about what kind of man you decided to be when no one was coming to save you. He turned off the lights, plunging the clinic into shadow, and glanced once more at Ranger, memorizing the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. 1 hour. Somewhere between now and then, the rules were going to change. And when they did, the people who thought they controlled this city were about to learn the difference between a criminal who exploited fear and a guardian who refused to live with it. Evan Cross didn't come home the way people expected soldiers to come home. There was no parade, no clean ending, no moment where the noise stopped and life neatly snapped back into place. He arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning with a duffel bag that smelled like dust and aviation fuel, a medical discharge packet folded too many times, and a nervous habit of checking exits before he sat down. To the outside world, he was a decorated former Navy special operator, quiet, disciplined, physically intact. To himself, he was a man who had left pieces of his nervous system scattered across places that never made the news. The first thing he noticed about civilian life was how loud it was in all the wrong ways. Car horns felt aggressive. Sirens made his shoulders lock up before his mind could catch up. Fireworks celebrations meant for children sent his pulse racing and his vision narrowing, his body preparing for an explosion that never came. Sleep didn't arrive gently anymore. It ambushed him in fragments, 90 minutes here, 45 there, punctuated by dreams that weren't quite memories but carried the same weight. In those dreams, he was always reaching someone too late. A door kicked in just seconds after the wrong sound. A radio call that crackled and died before coordinates came through. The Navy doctors called it post-traumatic stress. Evan knew that was only part of the truth. What they didn't have a clean name for was the heavier thing, the moral injury. The knowledge that sometimes you follow orders and still fail. Sometimes you make the right call tactically and live with the wrong outcome ethically. 2 years earlier, in a coastal city overseas, Evan had been part of a raid that went sideways. The intel was thin. The clock was wrong. A civilian stepped into the wrong hallway at the wrong moment. The after-action report was sanitized, the file classified, the operation labeled a success. Evan received a commendation he never hung on a wall. The family received silence. That was the night something essential fractured. He didn't talk about it. He didn't drink himself into oblivion or pick fights in bars. He did something quieter and more dangerous. He withdrew. He began to believe that maybe the world was safer if he stayed on the margins, useful but unseen. When a later mission ended with him freezing for half a second too long, a hesitation his team covered for, but command noticed his career stalled. Mandatory leave turned into separation paperwork. Just like that, the structure that had held him together vanished. By the time Evan drifted into Philadelphia, he wasn't looking for a fresh start. He was looking for anonymity. He took work where questions weren't asked. Night shifts unloading trucks at the port, temporary warehouse security, contract jobs fixing broken things no one wanted to touch. He rented a room by the week in a motel near the interstate, a place that smelled like old carpet and resignation. He told himself this was temporary. He told himself a lot of things. Statistics floated through his head sometimes, uninvited. Numbers he'd heard in briefings or read in articles he couldn't quite finish. An average of 17 veterans a day lost to suicide, nearly 1 in 3 reporting severe sleep disruption, high functioning on the outside, unraveling quietly inside. Evan didn't see himself as a statistic, but he understood the gravity behind the numbers. He felt it every time he woke up already exhausted, every time his hands shook just enough to notice when a lock clicked open behind him. What kept him going wasn't hope, it was routine. Wake up, work, gym, cheap dinner, repeat. He ran until his lungs burned because exhaustion was the closest thing to peace he could still access. He avoided relationships because connection required explaining, and explaining required words he didn't trust anymore. When people thanked him for his service, he nodded politely and changed the subject. Gratitude felt misplaced when he still carried the weight of the one time he hadn't been enough. That was the man sitting alone on a bench the afternoon he saw Maya Bennett in the park. He hadn't gone there for fresh air or reflection. He'd gone because the noise of the city faded just enough under the trees to let his thoughts slow down. He noticed patterns the way he always did, who lingered too long, who scanned instead of strolled, where lines of sight opened and closed. It wasn't paranoia, it was muscle memory. Then he heard laughter, not the sharp, performative kind he'd learned to distrust, but the genuine, unguarded sound of someone throwing a ball for a dog who believed with absolute certainty that the next throw would always come. Evan watched Ranger sprint across the grass, powerful and joyful, and something in his chest loosened just a fraction. Animals didn't pretend. They didn't posture. They protected what mattered because that was their nature. He didn't know Maya yet. He didn't know her profession or her history or the quiet resilience that had carried her through veterinary school and long nights on call. What he saw was a person at ease in her own space, someone who belonged where she stood. And when that space was invaded, when entitlement masquerading as confidence stepped too close, Evan felt the familiar internal shift, the one that came before action, the one that said, "This is where you stand up." This mattered because Evan wasn't chasing danger anymore. He was avoiding it. The man who intervened in that park wasn't a thrill seeker or a vigilante. He was someone who had spent years failing to forgive himself for the one time he hadn't stepped between harm and innocence fast enough. When Chase Marlowe crossed that line, Evan didn't see a rich kid with a bad attitude. He saw a test, not of strength, but of identity. There's a quiet truth many Americans understand intuitively but rarely articulate. The most dangerous people aren't the loud ones. They're the ones who feel untouchable, who believe consequences are for other people. Evan had seen men like that overseas and at home, insulated by money, rank, or politics. He'd also seen what happened when no one challenged them. Systems decayed, violence normalized. Ordinary people paid the price. Evan didn't think of himself as a hero. Heroes were clean in stories. They knew who they were. He felt more like a man walking around with a cracked compass, trying to orient himself by the few stars he still trusted. Protect the innocent, minimize harm, don't walk away when it counts. These weren't slogans. They were survival rules, hammered in by instructors and reinforced by loss. As he watched the scene in the park begin to tilt toward confrontation, Evan understood something with sudden clarity. Coming home wrong didn't mean he was broken beyond use. It meant the context had changed. The skills that kept him alive in war didn't evaporate just because the uniform was gone. The question was how to use them without becoming the thing he despised. That question hung in the air as footsteps approached Maya and Ranger. Evan stood, not because he wanted trouble, but because trouble had already arrived. Whatever happened next would ripple outward, pulling him back into a world he'd tried to exit quietly. And as he took his first step toward the unfolding conflict, Evan Cross wasn't reclaiming his past. He was testing whether a man who came home wrong could still choose to come home right. Rittenhouse Square had the kind of late afternoon calm that lulled people into lowering their guard. The trees were half bare, their leaves skittering across the paths in dry spirals as the wind funneled between the buildings. Office workers cut through the park with earbuds in, eyes on phones, minds already halfway home. Parents watched children climb on bronze statues. It was the sort of place where danger felt theoretical, something that happened on the news, somewhere else to someone else. Maya Bennett knew that illusion well. As a veterinarian, she'd learned early that calm could vanish in a heartbeat. One wrong movement, one misread signal, and even the gentlest animal could react. That awareness shaped how she moved through the world. She held Ranger's leash loosely but with intention, reading the set of his ears, the angle of his tail. Ranger was big, powerful, and trained not aggressive, but protective by instinct. He trusted Maya completely. She trusted him too, but she never forgot that trust came with responsibility. Evan Cross noticed them the same way he noticed everything, as a pattern that didn't quite match the background. A woman comfortable but alert, a dog engaged but scanning. It wasn't fear, it was competence. Evan felt his pace slow without thinking as he watched Maya toss a rubber ball. Ranger sprinted after it, muscles working cleanly under his coat, pure joy in motion. For a moment, the noise in Evan's head softened. There was something grounding about watching a creature do exactly what it was built to do. The laughter came next, loud, performative. It cut across the park like a thrown bottle. Evan's eyes shifted automatically toward the sound, his body angling just enough to give him a clear line of sight. Three men moved down the central path with the confidence of people who expected the world to step aside. And it did. A jogger veered, a couple separated slightly to let them pass. The leader wore his entitlement like a tailored coat, expensive, immaculate, and unnecessary for the weather. Chase Marlowe spotted Maya almost immediately. Men like him always did. Not because they were observant, but because they were constantly scanning for opportunities to assert themselves. His grin was practiced, predatory, the kind that had worked often enough to feel reliable. He peeled away from his friends, who slowed but stayed close, orbiting like satellites. "Now that's a serious dog," Chase said, loud enough to draw attention, his tone walking the line between admiration and challenge. "You sure you can handle him?" Maya didn't smile. She'd learned the cost of encouraging strangers who mistook attention for consent. "He's fine," she said evenly, shortening the leash by a few inches. "We're leaving." Chase stepped into her path, close enough that Maya could smell the cologne, sharp, expensive, overpowering. "Relax," he said. "I'm just making conversation." "What's his name?" Ranger shifted, placing his body slightly in front of Maya's legs. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not a growl yet, but a warning. Evan felt his jaw tighten. Dogs didn't escalate without reason. Neither should people. "Please move," Maya said, firmer now. "You're making him uncomfortable." Chase laughed, glancing back at his friends as if sharing a private joke. "Your dog's got an attitude. That usually comes from the owner." That was the moment Evan stood. Not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. He moved closer, staying on the edge of the scene, a presence rather than an intrusion. He'd learned long ago that most confrontations could be diffused by changing the math, adding a variable the aggressor hadn't accounted for. Chase reached out anyway, his hand closed around Maya's forearm, fingers digging through the sleeve of her parka. "Don't be rude," he said, the friendliness evaporating. "I'm talking to you." The sound Ranger made then turned heads. A full-throated warning, unmistakable and earned. He lunged forward just enough to force space between Maya and the hand gripping her. Chase stumbled back half a step, more surprised than hurt. His face flushed, not with fear, but with outrage. People like Chase weren't used to boundaries holding. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he snapped, yanking his hand free. His gaze dropped to Ranger, hard and ugly. "Get this animal away from me." Maya moved instantly, pulling Ranger back, kneeling to keep him close. "He's trained," she said. "You grabbed me. Please just walk away." Chase didn't hear her. He was already past listening. In his world, disrespect demanded correction. He drew his leg back and kicked Ranger in the ribs with all the force of someone who had never been held accountable for anything. The sound was sickening. A dull impact followed by a sharp yelp that cut through the park's ambient noise like a blade. Time seemed to stretch. Maya screamed Ranger's name, dropping to her knees as the dog staggered, gasping, trying to find air. Conversations died mid-sentence. A child started crying. Chase stood there, breathing hard, as if he'd accomplished something. That was when Evan closed the distance. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He placed a hand on Chase's shoulder and turned him around with controlled force, just enough to unbalance him. Evan's voice was low, calm, and unmistakably final. "You shouldn't have done that." Chase jerked away, eyes blazing as his friend started forward. "Do you know who I am?" he shouted, the words tumbling out on reflex. His hand slipped inside his coat and came back out holding a handgun, polished, oversized, meant to intimidate more than function. He leveled it at Evan's chest, his grip too tight, elbows locked, adrenaline doing most of the work. The park erupted. People screamed and scattered, diving behind benches and trees. Phones came out, shaky and desperate. Evan didn't move. He looked at the gun, then at Chase's hands. The stance, the tremor, the lack of discipline. To Evan, it wasn't a weapon yet. It was a problem with a solution. "You're holding it wrong," Evan said. Chase blinked, thrown off balance by the absence of fear. "What?" Before the word finished forming, Evan stepped inside the line of fire. His hand slapped the barrel aside as his other hand seized Chase's wrist, torque applied with surgical precision. There was a sharp crack as cartilage gave way. The gun clattered to the ground. Evan swept Chase's legs, drove him face first into the dirt, and pinned him there, knee between shoulder blades. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Silence followed, thick and stunned. Evan kicked the gun away and raised his hands as sirens wailed in the distance. He didn't look at Chase as the man screamed about his wrist. He looked at Maya, still kneeling beside Ranger, her hands shaking as she checked his breathing. Evan's chest tightened. He'd intervened 1,000 times before in different forms, but this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was supposed to be safe. When the police arrived, weapons drawn, Evan complied instantly. He announced the dismantled firearm, the witnesses, the assault. An older sergeant recognized Chase immediately. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, the tension easing, the tone softening. Power recognizing itself. Evan saw it then with brutal clarity. This wasn't just one entitled man. This was a system that bent around him. And as the sergeant quietly urged Evan to walk away, to let it go for his own good, Evan realized the line he'd crossed wasn't legal or physical. It was moral. He helped Maya lift Ranger carefully, ignoring the smirk spreading across Chase's face. Evan didn't argue, not yet. Some battles weren't won in the open. As he walked away from the park beside Maya, carrying the weight of an injured dog and a shaken woman, Evan understood the truth beneath the afternoon's violence. Entitlement didn't stop on its own. It only stopped when it met someone willing to stand in front of it and stay there. And that understanding carried them both forward, out of the park and into a conflict that was no longer avoidable, only survivable. The first lesson Evan Cross learned that evening was how quickly authority could change its posture. At the edge of Rittenhouse Square, beneath flashing red and blue lights, the scene reorganized itself with quiet efficiency. Patrol cars angled to block traffic. Officers moved with practiced urgency until recognition set in. The moment the senior sergeant saw Chase Marlowe's face, something unspoken passed through the ranks. Voices lowered, shoulders relaxed. The urgency drained away like water from a cracked vessel. Evan stood a few steps back, hands still visible, watching the exchange with the detached clarity of someone who had seen this movie before. The gun lay on the ground, clearly kicked out of reach. Witnesses hovered at a distance, phones raised, some recording, some uncertain whether recording would help or hurt them. Maya knelt beside Ranger, her jacket spread beneath his ribs as she tried to keep him still. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady. Every instinct Evan had screamed to stay, to insist, to force the issue. He did anyway. He assaulted her, Evan said calmly. He kicked the dog. He pulled a firearm in a public park. The sergeant nodded without meeting Evan's eyes. We'll take statements. Chase sat on the curb, clutching his wrist, already playing the part pain exaggerated, voice loud enough to carry. This guy attacked me, he shouted. I was defending myself. The sergeant leaned down, speaking to Chase in a tone that was almost deferential. Ambulance is on the way, sir. Tear, not to move. Evan felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes. Not anger, recognition. This wasn't incompetence. It was choreography. He stepped closer. There are multiple witnesses. The weapon. The sergeant straightened and finally looked at him. The look held apology and warning in equal measure. Sir, he said quietly, so quietly only Evan could hear. You need to leave. Evan stared back, incredulous. You're kidding. The sergeant shook his head almost imperceptibly. You don't understand how this works. That was the second lesson. Evan understood exactly how it worked. He'd seen versions of it overseas, where power wore uniforms or robes or carried the right stamps. He'd seen it at home too, just dressed in better fabric. The law existed, enforcement was optional. He didn't argue further, not because he agreed, but because he recognized a closed door when he saw one. He helped Maya lift Ranger carefully, ignoring the way Chase's eyes followed them, the smirk already returning despite the pain. As they walked away from the park, Evan felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. This wasn't over. It had barely begun. The veterinary clinic was warm and smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. It felt like a sanctuary, which made the violence that followed it all the more jarring. Maya moved on instinct, switching into professional mode as soon as Ranger was on the exam table. She checked pupils, palpated ribs, listened to breath sounds. Evan watched from the doorway, scanning the street through the blinds, cataloging shadows and parked cars. He's bruised badly, Maya said after several tense minutes. Possibly a hairline fracture, but no internal bleeding. He's strong. Evan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He nodded, then looked at the front door. The lock was old, the frame worn, the hinges loose. He retrieved a toolbox from a closet without asking and started tightening screws, reinforcing what he could. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. They didn't have long to wait. A black sedan rolled up to the curb less than an hour later, its engine purring softly before shutting off. Evan felt the shift immediately, the way Ranger's ears twitched, the way the air itself seemed to tense. The car door opened, and a man stepped out who looked nothing like his son. Dominic Marlowe moved with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He wore a charcoal suit tailored to perfection, no unnecessary gestures, no wasted motion. His hair was silver, combed back neatly, his face lined not by stress but by age and calculation. Two men flanked him, both alert, both scanning, both carrying themselves like professionals who had learned their trade somewhere far from city streets. Dominic approached the clinic door and stopped when Evan opened it, blocking the entrance with his body. "We're closed," Evan said. Dominic smiled politely. "Mr. Cross," he replied, as if confirming a suspicion. "I appreciate you coming out to meet me. I didn't invite you." "No," Dominic agreed, "but circumstances require conversation." He didn't push past. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, occupying space with an authority that didn't need volume. This wasn't a man who threatened because he enjoyed it. This was a man who threatened because it worked. "I'm here about my son," Dominic continued. "He's impulsive, passionate. He overreacts to perceived disrespect. He assaulted a woman and kicked her dog," Evan said flatly. Dominic's eyes flicked past Evan, searching for Maya inside. Emotions ran high. Things got out of hand. Evan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's your definition of out of hand?" Dominic reached into his jacket slowly. Evan tensed, every muscle ready to fire. Dominic withdrew an envelope and held it out, pinched neatly between two fingers. "I prefer clean solutions," he said. "Inside is enough to cover veterinary bills, emotional distress, and your inconvenience. There's also a first-class ticket. Anywhere you'd like to go." Evan stared at the envelope without taking it. "You think this fixes it?" Dominic chuckled softly. "Flick, this prevents escalation. You're a capable man, Mr. Cross. You understand leverage. Philadelphia isn't a war zone. It's a network, and networks respond poorly to disruption." That was the third lesson. This city didn't belong to the loudest criminals or the most violent ones. It belonged to the quiet men who owned infrastructure. Ports, unions, construction contracts, shipping lanes. They didn't need to run drugs on street corners when they controlled what moved through the docks. They didn't need to intimidate openly when they could make a phone call and make a problem evaporate. "I'm not interested," Evan said. Dominic's smile faded, just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "Then you misunderstand the offer." "I don't," Evan replied. "I'm refusing it." The temperature seemed to drop. Dominic leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Accidents happen every day. Gas leaks, electrical fires, brake failures. It would be tragic if something happened to this clinic, or the young woman inside." Evan stepped forward until they were inches apart. "If you or your son come near her again," he said quietly, "there won't be a next conversation." For a long moment, Dominic studied him, reassessing. This wasn't bravado. This wasn't negotiation. This was a boundary. Dominic straightened, slipped the envelope back into his jacket, and nodded once. "A soldier with a cause," he said, "noble, and usually short-lived." He turned and walked back to the car, the professionals falling into step beside him. The sedan pulled away without urgency. Inside, Maya had watched the exchange through the window, every word etched into her expression. "That was him," she said. "Wasn't it?" Evan nodded. "Yes." She sank into a chair, the weight of it all finally landing. "He owns the docks," she said quietly. "Half the unions. People don't cross that family and walk away." Evan crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes. "They don't own everything," he said. "They just want you to think they do." He spent the next hour doing more than fixing hinges. He walked Maya through simple, practical safety measures, lights on timers, checking mirrors, varying routines, emergency numbers written down. He wasn't turning her into a soldier. He was giving her agency. Knowledge was a form of armor. There was a lesson embedded in the night, one that resonated far beyond the clinic walls. Corruption rarely announces itself. It normalizes. It teaches people to accept small injustices because resisting them feels too costly. Over time, those small concessions stack until power becomes invisible and absolute. As Evan finally sat down, exhaustion creeping in, he understood the shape of the road ahead. Walking away hadn't ended the threat. It had clarified it. When a city belongs to one family, justice doesn't arrive by chance. It has to be invited in, sometimes at great cost. And as the quiet settled around them, broken only by Ranger's steady breathing, Evan knew the offer he'd refused was the last easy exit he would ever be given. The second strike came the way real violence usually does. Not loud, not dramatic, but patient and intentional. It arrived after midnight when exhaustion had softened the edges of awareness and the city outside the clinic had settled into its lowest rhythm. The streetlights hummed, a distant siren wailed and faded. Inside, the clinic was dark except for the faint glow of an emergency exit sign and the steady green pulse of a monitor keeping watch over Ranger's vitals. Evan Cross didn't sleep. He rested in fragments, sitting upright in a chair with his boots still on, senses tuned just enough to catch what others missed. Years of conditioning had taught him that the first night after a threat was always the most dangerous. Not because the enemy was angry, but because they were deciding, testing, measuring how far they could go without consequence. Ranger lay on a rug near the reception desk, his head bandaged, his breathing slow and even. Despite the sedatives, the dog's ears twitched at sounds too subtle for human notice. Maya had finally gone upstairs to the small apartment above the clinic, physically spent but unable to leave. Evan hadn't asked her to stay. He hadn't needed to. Fear had a way of anchoring people to familiar ground, even when familiar ground felt suddenly hostile. At 2:13 a.m., Ranger lifted his head. It was a small movement, almost nothing. But Evan felt it like a pressure change. He rose silently, heart rate steady, and eased toward the back hallway. The building creaked the way old structures always did, wood settling, pipes contracting. Then came a sound that didn't belong, a faint metallic scrape, careful, a deliberated. Someone was working the rear door. Evan didn't reach for a weapon. Not yet. He moved instead, placing himself in shadow, angling his body so he could see the hallway without being silhouetted by the exit sign. Ranger let out a low rumble, more vibration than sound. Evan held up a hand. The dog stilled. The lock gave way with a muted click, followed by a soft curse. A boot hit the door. Once. Twice. The reinforced frame held. There was a pause. Then glass shattered at the side window, sharp and final. The sound carried through the clinic like a drop plate in a quiet room. Shapes slid through the opening 5 men, dressed dark, moving with coordinated purpose. This wasn't Chase Marlowe's brand of arrogance. These men didn't shout. They didn't rush. They spread out, communicating with gestures and brief murmurs. Professionals, hired muscle. The kind Dominic Marlowe used when he wanted fear without fingerprints. The first man stepped onto the scatter of glass ampules Evan had spread beneath the window earlier. The crunch was unmistakable. The man looked down instinctively. That half second was enough. Evan exploded from cover, closing distance before the man could react. A palm strike snapped the attacker's head back, dropping him instantly. Evan pivoted, sweeping the legs of the second man and driving an elbow into his chest as he fell. Air rushed out of lungs. Will followed. Bodies hit the floor hard and fast. The remaining 3 reacted immediately. One swung a baton. Evan ducked, feeling the rush of air above his head, encountered with a knee that cracked ribs. Pain was a language Evan spoke fluently, but he didn't linger. He moved constantly, denying the attackers time to regroup. A blow glanced off Evan's forearm, too slow, too wide, but the impact sent a jolt of pain up his arm. He felt skin split. Blood slicked his hand. He ignored it. Pain meant he was still in the fight. Ranger barked, sharp and ferocious, lunging forward despite his injury. He slammed into one man's knee, taking him down long enough for Evan to finish the job. Another attacker tried to rush past toward the stairs. Evan intercepted him, driving him into a shelving unit with enough force to collapse it. The clatter echoed through the clinic, loud now, uncontrolled. Within seconds, it was over. The men who could still move dragged themselves toward the exit, fear replacing confidence as quickly as it had arrived. Evan stood amid the wreckage, chest heaving, blood dripping from a gash along his forearm. He watched them go, memorizing faces, ensuring they were retreating and not repositioning. Only then did the adrenaline fade enough for the cost to make itself known. His arm burned, his head rang faintly from a glancing blow he hadn't fully processed. Ranger staggered, his injured side trembling, and collapsed onto the rug with a pained whine. Evan dropped to his knees beside the dog, hands suddenly shaking as the reality of it set in. "I've got you," he whispered, pressing his forehead briefly against Ranger's. "I've got you." Maya appeared at the top of the stairs, gripping a baseball bat with white knuckles. She took in the scene, the shattered glass, overturned furniture, Evan kneeling in blood-spattered silence, and the color drained from her face. "Are they gone?" "Yes," Evan said. "For now." The word "for now" hung between them, heavy and unavoidable. They worked together without speaking much. Maya cleaned Evan's wound, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. She stitched Ranger's reopened injury, whispering reassurances even as tears tracked silently down her cheeks. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and copper. Outside, the city slept on, oblivious. When it was done, they sat on the floor, backs against the counter, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Evan flexed his injured arm, wincing. Maya stared at the door as if expecting it to open again at any moment. "This doesn't stop," she said quietly. "No," Evan agreed. "It escalates." That was the fourth lesson. Violence, once introduced, didn't retreat on its own. It adapted, it learned. Dominic Marlowe had tested boundaries with money. When that failed, he'd tried intimidation. Now he'd escalated to force, outsourcing brutality to keep his hands clean. This wasn't personal. It was procedural. "I can't call the police," Maya said. It wasn't a question. Evan shook his head. "Not for this." Silence stretched. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space. "There are federal agencies that don't belong to the city," Evan said finally. "People who care about evidence more than influence." Maya looked at him. "And you know them?" Evan hesitated. Calling them meant committing fully. No more half steps, no more hoping the storm would pass. It meant dragging what happened in the dark into the light and accepting whatever came with it. "Yes," he said, "but they won't move on fear. They'll need proof, the kind that sticks." Maya nodded slowly, absorbing the implication. "Then we find it." That moment mattered more than the fight. It was the moment Maya stopped being a protected civilian and became a partner. Not because, she wanted danger, but because she refused to let it dictate her life. The cost wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It was the loss of illusion. The knowledge that safety was no longer assumed, only managed. For many Americans, that realization came slowly, through headlines and statistics. For them, it had arrived at 2:13 a.m. Through a shattered window, he stood and looked around the clinic, now undeniably a battlefield. "This place won't be safe tonight," he said, "or tomorrow." Maya exhaled, steadying herself. "Then we adapt." Evan felt something shift inside him, not hope, but resolve, the kind that came from clarity. The second strike had failed to break them. It had done something far more dangerous to Dominic Marlowe's world. It had unified his opposition. As dawn crept toward the city, pale and indifferent, Evan reached for his phone. The number he dialed was one he hadn't used in years, a line reserved for emergencies that never quite ended. When the voice on the other end answered, Evan spoke with the calm certainty of a man who had finally accepted the path in front of him. "I need your help," he said, "and I can prove why." The war had crossed its final threshold. By morning, the city had resumed its routine as if nothing had happened. Traffic thickened along the highways. Coffee shops filled. Cargo ships slid quietly into the harbor, their massive hulls carrying the weight of global trade and plausible deniability. From a distance, the port of Philadelphia looked like efficiency, incarnate cranes arcing against the sky, containers stacked with geometric precision, paperwork flowing faster than anyone could track. It was the kind of place where millions of tons of goods moved each year, and no one asked too many questions, because asking questions slowed things down. Agent Nolan Reed asked them for facts, not fear. They met in a diner off I-95 just after sunrise, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a laminated menu that hadn't changed in a decade. Reed didn't wear a suit. He wore jeans, a jacket, and the tired focus of someone who had learned to separate emotion from evidence without losing his humanity. He listened without interrupting as Evan laid out the events park, police, offer, home invasion. Maya filled in the gaps with timestamps, injuries, descriptions. Reed wrote nothing down at first. He just watched them. When they finished, Reed took a sip of his coffee and nodded once. "You're right about one thing," he said. "Local law enforcement won't touch this. Not without cover. But if Dominic Marlowe is running something that crosses federal lines, that changes the equation." "What kind of proof do you need?" Maya asked. "The kind that survives a courtroom," Reed replied. "Shipping manifests, ledgers, buyer lists, chain of custody. Not photos of bruises or broken windows. Paper, data, something I can put in front of a judge and say, this is why we're here." Evan understood that language. It was the difference between suspicion and action. "If he owns the docks," Evan said, "then whatever he's hiding is moving through them." Reed's expression tightened. "We've had our eye on the Marlowe shipping group for years. Clean on paper, audited regularly. Every container accounted for on paper. But ports are pressure points, high volume, thin margins, perfect places to hide high-value, low-visibility cargo." Maya frowned. "Drugs?" Reed shook his head. "Too much attention, too much risk." Evan felt a familiar unease creep in. The most dangerous operations were always the ones people didn't expect. "Then what?" Reed leaned back. "Wildlife." The word landed heavier than any mention of narcotics or weapons. Maya felt it immediately, a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. She'd treated animals seized from illegal trades before, parrots with broken wings from cramped cages, reptiles dehydrated nearly to death, primates suffering from stress-induced self-harm. She knew the industry's shadow statistics by heart, tens of billions of dollars annually. One of the fastest growing black markets in the world. Low sentences, high profits. "It's quieter," Reed continued, "less scrutiny. And if you know how to move containers, it's easy to hide a few crates among thousands." Evan didn't need convincing. He'd seen how criminals adapted. "Where?" Reed slid a folded map across the table, tapping a section near the water's edge. "East Terminal, restricted access, a cluster of containers controlled by a Marlowe subsidiary. We've never gotten a warrant because we've never had a reason strong enough to justify it." Maya looked at Evan. He looked back. The unspoken truth passed between them. Getting that reason would require risk. That night, Evan moved through the port district like a shadow that refused to announce itself. He didn't wear a uniform or carry anything that couldn't be explained away if found. He moved on foot, avoiding cameras where possible, blending into the industrial sprawl where night workers and ghosts shared the same space. The port smelled like salt, diesel, and wet steel. The soundscape was constant engines idling, chains clanking, radios crackling in languages from half a dozen continents. Evan didn't rush. Rushing was how the mistakes happened. He observed. Patterns emerged. Which guards smoked together? Which routes forklifts favored? Where lights flickered just enough to create blind spots. This wasn't a raid, it was reconnaissance. The difference mattered. When he reached the cluster Reed had marked, he noticed the first anomaly immediately. The guards weren't bored, they were alert, better equipped than usual, rifles instead of sidearms. That kind of security wasn't for consumer goods. Evan waited until the rhythm shifted, until a truck departed, until radios went quiet for a few seconds and slipped between containers stacked like walls. The steel canyons swallowed sound. He found the container Reed suspected and eased the door open just enough to look inside. The smell hit him first, not chemical. Organic, musky, wrong. He shone a narrow beam of light into the darkness, careful to keep it low. Cages stacked to the ceiling. Inside them, eyes reflected back bright, frightened, alive. Hyacinth macaws huddled together, feathers dulled by stress. Pangolins curled into tight defensive balls, scales clattering softly against metal. Crates marked with falsified labels, shipping codes that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know how to read between the lines. Evan closed the door quietly, jaw tight. This wasn't just illegal, it was obscene. He moved quickly now, adrenaline sharpening focus without stealing control. A portable office trailer sat nearby, elevated on blocks, its windows dark. This was where decisions were made. Evan climbed the exterior ladder and slipped inside through a partially open skylight, landing silently on the thin carpet. The computer on the desk was locked, but not hardened the way high-level government systems were. Evan plugged in a small drive Reed had given him months earlier, a contingency tool Reed had insisted Evan keep just in case. The screen flickered. Files began to copy manifests, invoices, encrypted spreadsheets that mapped routes, buyers, bribes. Names surfaced, dates, patterns. This was the spine of the operation. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Evan didn't panic. He assessed. No second exit close enough. The skylight was too high to reach without noise. He moved behind a stack of filing cabinets as the door opened. Chase Marlowe stepped inside, agitated, followed by a large bodyguard. Chase grabbed his phone from the desk, muttering to himself, "I told you not to touch anything." The bodyguard frowned. "You leave the chair like that?" Evan pulled the drive free and waited exactly one heartbeat longer than instinct urged him to. Then he moved. The impact was sudden and brutal. Evan drove his shoulder into the bodyguard, sending him crashing into Chase. Both men stumbled. Alarms blared. Evan didn't stay to fight. He sprinted for the window, diving through glass as spotlights snapped on behind him. Bullets sparked off concrete, close enough to feel. He ran, climbed, leaped between containers with a desperation sharpened by purpose. By the time he disappeared into the maze of steel, the drive was warm in his pocket, heavy with consequence. Back at the clinic, Maya waited with Ranger at her feet, anxiety tightening every minute Evan was gone. When he returned, scraped, bleeding, but standing, she didn't ask what it had cost. She saw it in his eyes. "They're trafficking wildlife," he said quietly, handing her the drive. Maya closed her eyes, absorbing the truth she'd already feared. "Then we stop it." Reed met them hours later, this time in a secure office that smelled faintly of ozone and coffee. He watched the files populate across his screen, his expression darkening with each page. "This is it," he said finally. "RICO, federal wildlife statutes. Conspiracy. This takes down more than one family." Evan nodded. "I don't want credit." Reed glanced up. "You won't get it." But victory was never that simple. Before Reed could move, Dominic Marlowe adapted. He didn't deny. He didn't run. He escalated. Maya didn't return from her supply run that evening. Evan found her car abandoned 3 blocks from the clinic, groceries scattered across the pavement, milk pooling white under a streetlight. Ranger lay nearby, dazed, blood matting the fur behind his ear. Evan dropped to his knees, rage and guilt colliding in his chest. Ranger had tried to protect her. He always did. When Maya's phone rang minutes later, Evan answered without hesitation. Dominic's face filled the screen, calm as ever. "You have something of mine," Dominic said. "I have something of yours. 1 hour." Evan looked at the drive in his hand, then at Ranger struggling to lift his head. The investigation had crossed its point of no return. Evidence was no longer enough. Now it was personal, and the clock had started again. The Franklin Foundry rose out of the fog like a rusted monument to a different era, its skeletal beams and broken windows looming over the river's edge. Once, it had forged steel for bridges and rail lines that carried a growing nation forward. Now it stood abandoned, a hollow shell where sound echoed too long and light died too quickly. It was the kind of place men chose when they believed they controlled every variable. Evan Cross parked a mile away and continued on foot, the city's distant glow fading behind him. He carried only what he needed, no excess, no bravado. The drive with the evidence was secured inside a waterproof sleeve against his chest, not because he planned to trade it, but because it mattered where it ended up. Ranger moved at his side despite the bandage around his head, slower than usual but determined, ears flicking at every shift in the wind. Evan rested a hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, a silent promise that neither of them was walking into this alone. Dominic Marlowe believed in leverage. He believed that when you took what someone loved and put a clock on it, you owned them. He had built his empire on that belief. What he hadn't planned for was a man who understood that time could be weaponized both ways. Inside the foundry, floodlights cast harsh white pools across the concrete floor. Steam drifted from old pipes, hissing like something alive. At the center stood Dominic, immaculate as ever, flanked by men who didn't wear street clothes or expensive cologne. These were professionals, former soldiers, contractors who'd learned their trade in places where rules bent easily. Their rifles rested comfortably in their hands. They didn't underestimate Evan. They assessed him. Maya was nowhere in sight. Evan stepped into the light, Ranger at heel. "Where is she?" he asked, voice steady. Dominic smiled faintly. "Right on time. I appreciate punctuality." He gestured upward. Evan followed the motion with his eyes. Above them, in a glass-walled office suspended over the factory floor, Maya sat bound to a chair. Her face was bruised, but her posture was upright. She met Evan's gaze and nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement that she was still herself. "That drive," Dominic said, "on the table. We end this cleanly." Evan set it down where Dominic could see it. He didn't release it. Not yet. Dominic leaned forward slightly. "You've caused a great deal of inconvenience, but I'm a reasonable man." The word reasonable echoed strangely in the cavernous space. Evan saw the pattern forming, the way Dominic's men subtly adjusted their stances, the way the floodlights left deep shadows between machines. This wasn't a simple exchange. It was a trap designed to end with Evan on the floor and the evidence erased. Evan moved first. He hurled a small object not toward the men, but toward the ground at their feet. The flashbang detonated in a burst of white and thunder, overwhelming senses honed for precision. In the split second of disorientation, Evan closed the distance. Chaos exploded outward. Gunfire erupted, wild and panicked, bullets sparking off steel columns. Evan moved through it with controlled urgency, never staying still, never wasting motion. He disarmed one man, drove another into a stack of scrap metal, used the environment as a force multiplier rather than a shield. Ranger surged forward, tackling a guard at the knee and sending him crashing, then backing away on command, disciplined even in the frenzy. Above them, in the glass office, Chase Marlowe paced, panic stripping away the last of his swagger. He fumbled with a pistol, hands shaking. He had never learned to operate under pressure. He saw his father's world collapsing below and made the only decision he knew how to make. He aimed at Evan's back. Maya saw it too. "Evan!" she shouted, her voice cracking through the chaos. Evan pivoted instinctively, dropping to one knee as he turned. He fired once, not to kill, to end the threat. The bullet struck the slide of Chase's weapon, tearing it from his grip and sending it skidding across the office floor. Chase screamed and collapsed, clutching his hand, the fight leaving him in an instant. On the factory floor, the remaining guards hesitated. That hesitation cost them. Evan pressed forward, dismantling resistance with grim efficiency until only Dominic remained, standing frozen amid the wreckage of his carefully constructed order. Dominic's composure finally broke. He backed away, hands raised. "This doesn't end the way you think," he said, voice thin now. The system challenged," Evan replied. He took one step closer. "When people stop being afraid of it." The foundry doors blew inward with a concussive roar. Federal agents flooded the space, weapons trained, voices commanding. Agent Nolan Reed led the charge, badge visible, warrant in hand. The scene crystallized in an instant. Dominic Marlowe on his knees, evidence on the table, his network exposed under harsh light. Maya was freed moments later, her legs unsteady as she descended the stairs. Evan caught her before she fell. For a second, the noise faded. The violence receded. There was only the simple fact that she was alive. In the days that followed, the story unraveled in public the way it never had in private. Indictments stacked quickly: racketeering, conspiracy, wildlife trafficking, corruption. The evidence Evan had pulled from the port connected to other cases, other ports, other men who had believed themselves untouchable. Assets were frozen, contracts dissolved. Names that had once commanded quiet respect appeared in headlines with the word "arrested" beneath them. Dominic Marlowe no longer owned the city. He barely owned the clothes he wore to court. At the clinic, life returned slowly, unevenly. Ranger healed, Maya slept in longer stretches. Evan met with Reed one last time, refusing interviews, refusing recognition. "I don't need my name attached to this," he said. Reed nodded. "That might be the smartest thing you've done." Evan's orders came soon after. One final deployment, 6 months, a clean end. He stood in the clinic on his last afternoon, sea bag at his feet, the television murmuring news in the background. Maya handed him a cup of coffee and smiled, tired but real. 6 months, she said. 6 months, he agreed. Ranger pressed his head against Evan's leg, tail wagging once, solid and certain. Evan knelt and scratched behind the dog's ears, the familiar grounding weight of living fur under his hands. Hold the line, he whispered. As Evan walked out into the Philadelphia afternoon, the air felt different, lighter. Not because the world was suddenly safe, but because something essential had been reclaimed. The foundry behind him would rust back into silence. The city would move on, but the lesson would remain. Power built on fear always overreaches. Guardians don't need permission. And sometimes the most meaningful victories aren't the ones that make you famous, but the ones that let you come home knowing you stood where you were needed. Evan didn't look back as he merged into traffic, not because he was leaving something behind, but because for the first time in a long while, he knew exactly where he was headed. Subscribe for stories where justice doesn't come easy, but it comes.